the Politics of Polyamorous Identities and the Popular Fantastic. The popular is kind of necessary. I usually present extemporaneously because I believe that I'm more engaged that way with the subject. However, I realized last night that I would be hard-pressed to concentrate enough to do a cohesive job like that today, because it takes my brain a little while to process good news. So I typed this up at the last minute instead. If I start speaking too quickly, just wave something in the air and I'll adjust accordingly. This presentation is part of my ongoing research into the ethical and/or consensual non-monogamous identities as represented in the fantastic. It might be a bit of a rough go since my work is still in progress, so I beg your indulgence and patience if this comes across as disjointed. For those who are not familiar, I would like to briefly contextualize what mononormativity and consensual non-monogamy are, and how my research places both as subjects of discussion in fantastic scholarship. Forgive me as I refer to my previous publication to elucidate. Mononormativity is a term coined by sociologists Piper and Bauer, 2006, to refer to the societal assumption of relationships as inherently monogamous, and which I have previously argued can be used as a theoretical approach to critically examine the fantastic, as I find the estrangement in the fantastic can even unintentionally produce texts that question societal mononormativity. Ethical or consensual non-monogamy refers to a group of alternative relationship styles, or more correctly, is an umbrella term for non-normative relationship structures that eschew the expectation of sexual exclusivity, that is, monogamy, in a two-person relationship. Some proponents of consensual non-monogamy now find that ethical is problematic as it assumes a universal set of mores and ethics. So for the purposes of this talk, and to save you all from repeatedly hearing the same long term, I will refer to CNM. CNM is often touted by proponents as inherently feminist, standing in opposition to patriarchal and religion-based monogamy and polygamies, think Big Love, HBO's Big Love. While Dan Savage refers to monogamy as a quote-unquote one-size-fits-all model for relationships, I'd like to go a step further and label CNM as a choose-your-own-adventure structure. The flexibility CNM offers to non-heteronormative, non-binary, and differently sexualized identities allows for adaptations that are based on the needs of those involved. Not only LGBTQ individuals find freedom of relationship expression in CNM, but also genderqueer and grayscale identities such as asexuals. In this presentation, I will briefly examine how the term polyamory is reflected in and/or how consensual non-monogamy forms political identities in 4 works, very briefly. Robert A. Heinlein's Stranger in a Strange Land, Malinda Lo's second adaptation novel titled Inheritance, Laurell K. Hamilton's Anita Blake series, popular, right? And Jacqueline Carey's first Terre d'Ang novel, Kushiel's Dart. Although I could include Hamilton's Married Gentry novels and Carey's other Terre d'Ang novels, it'll be a wild ride just to cover those I've listed, and such an inclusion wouldn't add anything substantial to my point, or rather points, for not only do these portrayals of consensual non-monogamy reflect the current sociological research on CNM, they also show that even the single term polyamory is not a concrete and universal identity label, but rather a continuum or spectrum of, if you'll excuse the pun, polymorphous existences. I find it rather difficult to avoid including Heinlein's Stranger in a Strange Land in this discussion. He was arguably the most prominently prolific writer of America's golden age of SFF to directly question mononormativity. The Nest and Stranger functions as a group marriage of sorts, which is a type of polyamory. Jubal Harshaw, the father figure of the titular stranger Mike, notes the idealistic beauty of such a concept, but finds it as doomed to failure as some of our real-world non-monogamous cultures. For Sam, a member of the Nest, adroitly notes, they expect trouble, as, quote, no society, no matter how liberal its own laws may appear to be, that's my emphasis, will allow its basic concepts to be challenged with impunity, end quote. In other words, no dominant normative political system will quietly surrender to its own obsolescence. This sentiment is stated differently by Milton Friedman, and here I owe a note of thanks to Mark Gold's keynote yesterday, for the quote was not originally in my prepared notes. Quote, "There is an enormous inertia, a tyranny of the status quo in private and especially governmental arrangements," end quote. Again, emphasis is mine. "The repercussions exacted upon the nest and stranger are far more than merely political, and though the political identity of the nestmates, which is more than just non-mononormativity, is at the heart of their persecution and Mike's murder by an angry mob. The protagonists of Hamilton's Blake novels and Lowe's Inheritance also can't avoid the pushback effects of such a status quo as mononormativity enjoys. I hesitated to include Hamilton's Blake here, not only because I feel the series necessitates including the word popular in my title, but also because Anita Blake doesn't consent to ethical or consensual non-monogamy. She is effectively forced into it through her acquisition of her lover Jean-Claude's argeux, a vampiric ability and undeniable need to feed off of sexual energy. Initially, none of Blake's male lovers are involved with other people, and her relationships form what one might call a polyandry. Nonetheless, by the time the series reaches its 19th book, Bullet, it is clear that Anita's boyfriends and lovers, which are not necessarily the same thing, are sleeping with other people. In book 20, Hit List, Anita's friend and occasional bounty hunting partner turned marshal, Edward, asks Anita if she is quote-unquote polyamorous. She denies it, but he retorts, quote, "You're living with multiple men and sleeping with more, and everybody knows about it. That's about as poly as you can get," end quote. By the 21st book, Kiss the Dead, Anita is not only using that identity label for herself, but is exemplifying an observation by psychologists Barker and Landridge that, quote, "people have claimed some forms of CNM, notably polyamory, as an identity label rather than a practice," end quote. A police detective tells Anita in her role as a U.S. Marshal that her quote-unquote loyalties to her job are believed to be compromised by her personal life. Anita goes quickly on the defensive, saying, quote, "You've obviously decided to use my sexual orientation against me. I'm polyamorous, which means loving more than one person, and what I heard was you saying the fact that I wasn't white-bread, missionary position monogamous compromised my loyalty. Isn't that what they used to say about homosexual officers too?" End quote. While this is the first time Anita directly confronts discrimination for her quote-unquote polyness, it is neither the first time she is on the defensive against somebody treating her poorly for being a quote-unquote slut, nor is it the last time the word polyamorous and its related concepts pop up in the Blake series. For example, later in Kiss the Dead, there is a mention of quote-unquote closed poly, which is described as, quote, "like monogamy with only one other person added," end quote. Though books like The Ethical Slut by Easton and Hardy term it polyfidelity, without any limit on the number of people involved in a closed, sexually exclusive within the group dynamic. The Blake stories also touch on other aspects of existence within a CNM relationship that are discussed in such self-help styled nonfiction titles like The Ethical Slut and sex educator Tristan Taormino's Opening Up. Namely, the negotiation and communication involved, the scheduling difficulties, the emotional labor it can require, and the toll of losing one out of many relationships. So for all that one is hard-pressed to consider the Blake series as literary by any, again, pun intended, fantastic stretch of the imagination, this popular series clearly represents several political and personal realities of identifying as poly. As noted before, it is not just the horror-erotic, I Googled and that's actually a real word now and I love it, horror-erotic Blake novels confronting these issues, but also Malinda Lowe's YA novel Inheritance, spoilers. The teenage Reese feels torn between her feelings for David, a teenage human, and Amber, an alien who, for all intents and purposes, appears and acts as a teenage human. Reese initially rejects both the structure and the label of poly, as she cannot find, quote, any other way to deal with, in quote, her feelings, but to break things off with both of her love interests. Eventually, David, who was also not too keen on the notion, acknowledges that how Reese, quote, feels is way more important than how people think about them, end quote. Reese relents, quote, we'll talk about it. I want to be with you, and I want to be with her, and I want to try to make it work, end quote. Again, as with Blake, we see the internal negotiation involved in coming to terms with an identity label that can bring with it discrimination by and judgment from others. However, among Amber's people, the Emrians, quote, it isn't unusual or uncommon for them to be in relationships of more than two people, end quote. And Amber reveals that she has 3 biological parents, gene splicing. Reese is not sure how to proceed, as she notes, quote, humans don't normally do this. If I start thinking about what might happen when other people, the public, find out, I might have a panic attack, end quote. Here, it is obvious that Reese's main fear is not how to make it work, but how to avoid it getting out to the public at large. For the 3, along with the rest of the Emrians on Earth, have become the objects of public fascination and frankly what I can only describe as a media circus. The narrative reveals that, quote, ultimately it was going through the experience of having their relationship revealed to the public that brought them closer together. Reese had known it would get out, but she wished there had been more time for the 3 of them to work it out in private. They talked about how to deal with the fallout. There had been so much immediate judgment, so much snide commentary and innuendo, along with disconcertingly vocal support from the tiny polyamorous community, that it felt like being thrust into the center of a tornado. When the possibility of spending a year on Amber's home planet, where plural relationships were normal, was raised, Reese knew that they had to go. They might be able to figure it out on their own here on Earth, but it could only be easier if they were in a place where nobody thought their arrangement was unusual, end quote. Just to be clear about what happens, the public reaction to their relationship structure drives them to leave for another planet for a year in order to do the hard work necessary in building a healthy dynamic for their C&M without outside interference from what Heinlein might deem the Mrs. Grundys of the world. All because Earth is not a, quote, place where nobody thought their arrangement unusual, end quote. I think it's a pretty profound statement that Lowe's fictional teens exile themselves from Earth in order to be themselves. And I believe it can be read as an allegory for the countless, unable to be counted because they are hidden, closeted polys in our society, who are afraid of the very real discrimination, such as that which Blake is on the receiving end of, censure, and judgment because they are not afforded protections under the law for what Blake calls a sexual orientation, but others deem a romantic orientation. So far we've looked at one of the earliest examples in Stranger, as well as 2 more recent examples in the popular fantastic of directly confronting the social repercussions of openly living as consensually non-monogamous in a mononormative society. But what if that society is socially and politically constructed around a divinely given tenet that is explicitly non-mononormative? Carey's Terre d'Homme provides a glimpse of what that might be like. The Angelines follow the precept of Blessed Alua, whose divine parentage is a bit complicated, so I'm just not even going to get into it here, who bade them to, quote, love as thou wilt, end quote. This transcends class distinctions and carries with it all the weight of religious convictions that one might expect of a divine command. Throughout the course of the first novel, Kushiel's Dart, the reader is repeatedly reminded of Alua's edict as one follows the adventures of Phaedra, an anguisette chosen by one of Alua's divine disciples, Kushiel, to experience pain as pleasure, as denoted by the eponymous dart, or red mote in her eye. It is gradually revealed, again spoilers, that Prince Roland of Terre d'Homme is deceased by the time of Dart's events, was once in love with Delany, the man who, again this gets complicated, owns Phaedra's indentured services and an anguisette courtesan until such time as she earns enough to buy her freedom. Rather than contract her out for mere money, Delany sends her declines he wishes to gain information from or about. In other words, he uses her, along with teaches her and basically treats her as a daughter, as a sort of divinely blessed, uniquely talented alternative Earth Matahari. Delaunay does so in order to protect the daughter of his departed beloved Prince Roland, fulfilling a promise he made to Roland, the man who had been his lover since they were both at the University of Tiberium. Dart also makes clear that Roland's first betrothed, Edme, who had been a childhood friend to Delaunay, quote, understood that she was trading passion to be the eventual queen of Terdang. She dies amidst some intrigue, which quite frankly is nothing surprising in a trilogy full of political intrigue. And though Roland's eventual princess consort Isabella and Roland's father, the king, are less than thrilled about Delaunay swearing to protect Roland's daughter Yasandra, they cannot block it without violating Ilua's dictate to, quote, love as thou wilt, end quote. For to come between lovers, even after death, in the face of an oath sworn in front of the priests of Ilua, seems tantamount to sacrilege. Rape is also firmly in the realm of heresy. Eventually, after Delaunay dies, Phaedra, out of love for Delaunay, not sexual but love nonetheless, carries on his task to protect Yasandra, now queen of Terdang, from those who would usurp her crown. Phaedra is accompanied by Jacqueline, a Castilian brother, which is sort of a monastic order sworn to chastity and modeled after Ilua's quote-unquote perfect companion, Kushiel. For while Terdang is wholly non-mononormative and entirely sex and kink positive, it is not prescriptively so. Love as thou wilt carries with it no injunction to be in a romantic or sexual relationship, have sex, or produce offspring, just to love as the heart and body desire in the way they will. Of course, Jacqueline and Phaedra fall in love, which is pretty much the biggest ongoing romantic drama that underlies all of the intrigue and action packed into Dart, and there's a lot of that. Jacqueline struggles for most of Kushiel's Dart with conflicting divine directives, his vows to the Castilian Brotherhood, and Ilua's edict to love as thou wilt. Eventually, and even though it is against his vows to the Brotherhood and leads to his expulsion from the order, he gives in to his love for Phaedra. But the only censure he faces for breaking his Castilian vows is from the Brotherhood. A priest of Ilua tells Jacqueline that, quote, like Kushiel, Jacqueline will ever stand at the crossroads and choose, again and again, the path of the companion, end quote. In other words, though Jacqueline is kicked out of the order modeled on the perfect companion, Ilua's priest affirms that Jacqueline is still on the path of the companion because, quote, Ilua's commandment directs his way, end quote. Queen Yasandra inquires of Phaedra near the end of the novel, quote, will you wed your Castilian, end quote. Thus, like the priest, the queen still considers Jacqueline to be a Castilian in spite of his removal from the Brotherhood. There are restrictions on sexual activity in Terdang, including a specialness placed on virginity, though not for the reasons one sees in patriarchy-centric societies in our real world. But there are very few of these restrictions, and none of them supersede Ilua's command to love as thou wilt. Instead, one finds a richly detailed society where practically anything goes, so as long as it's consensual and rooted in love and desire of one form or another. It is no scandal for a prince to have a male lover, and it is only a minor scandal for a Castilian brother to break his vows for the sake of love. Orgies, morisms, kink, and other non-normative expressions of sexuality not only exist, but are openly celebrated in the night court's sexually charged and sex-positive atmosphere. And to sell one's body for pleasure is to seen as acting as a servant of Nama, she who gave her body for coin and bread to support Ilua in his wanderings. I hope I've made it clear that the polyness, quote unquote, seen in the Blake stories is not the same as seen as Lowe's adaptation, allowing for polyamory to be seen on a spectrum that comprises only part of the larger CNM spectrum. For certainly, neither of these polyamories are exactly like the group marriage seen in Stranger's Nest, or the societal non-mononormativity at the heart of Terdang, or any of the other CNM relationships I've researched during the past couple of years. We live in societies often ruled by binary and oppositional concepts, on, off, good, bad, male, woman, man, woman, and so on. I think this includes a societal construct of either committed and monogamous or single and sleeping around. And that is what lies at the foundation of this paper. People in a normative mindset often assume that everyone is one label, thing, gender, what have you, or its normatively constructed opposite. In the words of Judith Butler in Gender Trouble, quote, binary restrictions nevertheless still operate to frame and formulate sexuality and delimit and advance the forms of resistance to the real, end quote. The nuances of erasing normative social binary constructs to allow for and be replaced by spectrum-based models are something that we all see on a regular basis, and I don't find it a bold claim to state that such actions are inherently political, particularly in current social environments prevalent in the West. Allowing for a spectrum-based expression of sexual, romantic, and/or intimate relations doesn't preclude absolute monogamy or absolute singlehood. It only provides for the recognition of those liminal identities that find freedom to, quote, love as thou wilt, end quote, without discrimination, persecution, and fear of living openly as oneself. Thank you.